It's Wednesday, the 7th of December. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Vicky Ford, Scottish National Party MP Drew Hendry, Daily Mirror political editor John Stevens and Times Radio's chief political commentator Lucy Fisher. Today,
if everyone in the public sector were to receive a pay rise in line with inflation, that would cost an extra £28 billion, an extra £1,000 per household.
Lives are being lost because we cannot staff the ambulance service and health service because the government has presided over a decade of real terms pay cuts.
'Tis the season to strike, but who's Scrooge, the government or the unions?
I don't think Michelle Mone should have been made appear in the first place, but I think what this exposes is there is something rotten at the heart of the Tory party.
Labour go on the attack over the Tory baroness embroiled in a row over lobbying for COVID contracts.
Britain is one of the most centralised systems in Europe, and the centre has not delivered.
Can Keir Starmer's devolution offer change minds in Scotland? And after U-turns on house building and wind farms to placate his own MPs, Rishi Sunak faces Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's Questions. We'll bring you that live at noon. You heard there in the headlines, the Health Secretary and union boss over strike action. No resolution yet over the forthcoming action from the RMT, amongst others, over Christmas. So the question for the panel to start the programme is, who's winning the battle, Vicky, for hearts and minds? Is it the government or striking workers?
I just think the whole thing is so sad. I'm an NHS doctor's wife. I absolutely understand how important those who work in public services are. But to come to these strikes and the impact that's going to have on other people. In my constituency in Chelmsford, I've got hundreds of kids who get on the trains every day to get in and out of school, and they're not going to be they're going to be struggling again. You'll have people who are desperate to get back to family for Christmas. We haven't had a Christmas for 3 years and they're just not going to be able to get there because they're striking on
So
New Year's
are you
Eve.
saying then the public is supporting the government on this?
So I think that what the public are seeing is incredibly difficult economic times. We've got this global inflation caused by Putin's war in Ukraine. And the public get that if people are given unaffordable pay rises, you're just going to push inflation up and up and up even more, and that makes everybody poorer. And people get that. When I'm on the doorsteps, they get that.
All right, who's winning, John, in this battle for hearts and minds?
I think the Tory government clearly miscalculated on this one. That at the beginning of this, when it was just the rail union, they were keen to ratchet this up. They thought this was something they could hit Keir Starmer over the head with. And now it's spread to all sorts of different industry, all different sectors. They've realised that there are millions of people now potentially being balloted to go on strikes, and this is a problem for them. And when people have problems, when they can't get an ambulance, when they can't get a train, they'll be blaming the ministers, thinking they haven't done enough to avert these strikes.
Vicky?
So I don't think that's a fair accusation because, you know, obviously the unions need to be talking with the employers and the government needs to work to facilitate those discussions, which they have done. But you've got, for example, the nurses, and God bless nurses, we need nurses, but asking for nearly 20% pay rise.
It's unaffordable,
and it's
is it?
Completely unaffordable.
OK.
And that inflation hits everybody.
Drew, there are strikes in Scotland, school strikes today and tomorrow. I understand you've got your own issues. Who's winning the battle there?
Well, I think people have... people who are on strike are people with families.
Yeah.
They're facing the same cost of living crisis that other people are facing as well. They've got the same worries about putting food on the table, about paying their bills. They're in the middle of an energy crisis, and Vicky and our colleagues love to try and blame all this on global factors, but let's face it.
Well, who do you blame for it?
Well, they've created a lot of this inflation, in particular food price inflation, especially through Brexit. Which
will you be paying teachers more? Will you be paying workers inflation-busting pay rises?
Well, the offers that are being made in Scotland are already higher than the offers that are being made in the rest of the UK. But of course, Scotland has a limited budget because of the devolution settlement. What we've said to very clearly is we've said to the Chancellor should have been, for example, with the NHS doing an above inflation increase so that we could pass that on to NHS workers. Nurses are already on average paid more in Scotland than the rest of the UK, and they were given a higher pay offer than the rest of the UK. We'd like to do more, but of course we don't have borrowing powers, we don't have the financial powers, and that's why it's
you could make different choices. You're limited, I know, in the way that you said, but you could make different choices. It's always easy to blame Westminster for not taking a decision yourself.
We could if we had the powers to do that, but they've been blocked time and time again, especially borrowing powers, which would have given us the flexibility to make the kind of choices that you're talking about.
We'll come on to more borrowing powers, as Labour is suggesting later on in the programme. Who's winning this battle?
Well, I don't think it's Rishi Sunak. I think those people, many people have sympathy, particularly with NHS workers whose pay has failed to keep pace with inflation for over a decade. That's why the ask now is so high. But even those members of the public who I think want the government to act more toughly against strikers are angry that successive prime ministers haven't followed through on the 2019 manifesto pledge to bring in legislation to curb the ability of workers to strike and ensure minimum service.
Well, you have just brought that point up here in the Financial Times. Rishi Sunak under pressure to accelerate anti-strike legislation. Exactly what Lucy was talking about. What's happened to it? Where is it?
I don't actually know, at the moment.
I mean, would you like to see it?
Focusing on the strike. I think we do need to make sure that we get the public sector working.
Right.
You know, absolutely. I look at my Chelmsford constituents, and many of them are waiting for operations, for example, because of
Well, then why not go ahead with this anti-strike legislation?
The government's actually put quite a lot more money into the NHS. That was one of the winners in the autumn statement. But I think right now we need to resolve the situation and make sure that actually we have affordable pay rises across the whole
So do you think the government should get on with this anti-strike legislation, which your colleagues, some of them, are calling for in order to prevent the situation?
I'm sure the government will be looking at all the different legislation that we need. I mean, for example, we're giving a lot of time at the moment to the online safety bill, which is really, really important. So often this is a question of how things are tabled in Parliament. I'll be looking at the Financial Services and Markets bill, which again is really important.
Well, I mean, as it so happens...
time.
Yeah, no, I mean, Vicky is pointing to also the fact Mark Harper has underlined this idea. It's not a priority. Apparently, he's just said it in the Select Committee, the Transport Secretary. Is that a surprise?
No, it's not a surprise in a way. I think the government, is really struggling to get through any legislation at the moment on even more pressing issues.
Yeah, well, let's talk about some of those other pressing issues. Whether they're more pressing or not, I will leave viewers to decide, because Rishi Sunak hasn't given in so far to the strikes or the strikers over pay or increasing the pay. But he has to his MPs over the rebellion on housing targets and onshore wind. Let's have a look at this headline in The Guardian. Onshore wind farm rule to be relaxed in new U-turn. And this was despite him saying during the leadership campaign this in a tweet. Rishi Sunak, energy self-sufficient by 2045, massive expansion in offshore wind, scrap plans to relax the ban on onshore wind. He has, in fact, just agreed to do precisely the opposite. What has it done to Rishi Sunak's authority, Vicky?
I think when I listen to colleagues and chat with colleagues, they've been quite pleased that the government's been listening to them. So I've asked a lot of colleagues what their views were on onshore wind, and most of them, provided the local community accepts it, they're relaxed. They see the need for energy security, for renewable energy, and they're saying if local communities want it, they should have it.
Isn't it embarrassing when you see that tweet, and it's very clear, scrap plans to relax the ban on onshore wind, and now he's agreed to relax the ban on onshore wind because of an amendment by Conservative colleague Simon Clarke. It's embarrassing.
Well, I think it's important that the government listens to what their MPs have got to say. OK, and there's been a lot of stories
and bend, even if he believes
the opposite.
There's
been a lot of stories in the press about how the majority of the public would actually support more onshore wind. Public opinions changed. Yeah. We've seen the increasing rise in energy.
Where's the evidence of that?
Well, we've seen.
The only thing that's changed is Rishi Sunak's changed his view because of the circumstances.
Well, I think the circumstances have changed because of the huge rise in energy bills that people have
When was
seen.
this? What was the date of this tweet from Rishi Sunak? It would have been this summer, long after the invasion of Ukraine.
I'm just telling you, because the question is, how is Rishi's authority working with colleagues?
That'll be Rishi Sunak on the phone for you. I'll let you deal with the phone. But is it the right decision? If public opinion has moved, is it the right decision to actually say we should relax the ban on onshore?
The ban on onshore wind and solar power, by the way, was always ridiculous. The fact
All right,
is
so you agree then with...
Well, the fact is that, you know, we should have been having more of a rush towards renewable electricity over the past few years in order to keep up with the, not only with the issues around climate change, which is an emergency, but also to make sure that we're actually driving bills down. Instead, they've wasted billions upon billions on new nuclear, which is going to take decades to get going and leaves a massive environmental footprint afterwards. This should have been a priority for this UK government. It was actually not even included in the contracts for difference auctions, nor was solar, and they've put the UK, and fortunately Scotland has used environmental and planning powers to get round that so that we can licence onshore wind, but they've put the UK way behind where it should be in terms of getting renewable electricity put on the grid.
How embarrassing is this for Rishi Sunak, Lucy, when you think about both these U-turns? One on the housing targets, they're now no longer going to be mandatory, and, as we've been talking about, the relaxation on onshore wind ban.
Yeah, and of course weakening the online harms bill too. I think it is embarrassing. You know, when you look on paper, the Conservative Party has a majority of 69. By historical standards, that's a very commanding majority. And you'd think the government would be able to push through quite a bold legislative agenda with that. And yet he's inherited a party that is so split, that has got out of the habit of discipline. And indeed, I think many of the 2019 Red Wall MPs who arrived immediately, we sort of had the pandemic, they grew up under a different sort of system, weren't as controlled by the whips. I think it's very difficult to see how he tries to stamp his authority on the party, get legislation through, and try and ward off this sense of drift at the heart of government.
Vicky?
First of all, sorry for the phone. That's my weekly alarm
We're moving
to remind
on.
me it's nearly PMQs. But
You need an alarm to remind you of PMQs?
Anyway, get in and get my seat. So I think actually on this planning situation, you know, we only have a planning bill about once a decade. There were lots in the package that came out yesterday of suggestions from MPs. There were some really helpful things that will encourage more building on brownfield first, that will help stop the land banking, so to make sure that we can get homes, especially for young people. So a lot of MPs were saying, you know, my experience from my constituency, I'm seeing this. It's important that MPs can suggest improvements to a bill, and that's what's happened. And what I have felt with colleagues is they're glad they've been listened to.
But isn't the truth, Vicky, the reason that Rishi Sunak has been buffeted all over the place is because he doesn't have an anchor. He's ditched the Tory manifesto and loads of the pledges that were in it from 2019. You and your MP colleagues didn't endorse his leadership platform, so he doesn't have some firm agenda that he can impose discipline and say, you have to back this because I've got a mandate for it.
I think the Prime Minister has got an incredibly difficult time. We've got war in Europe for the first time in my lifetime. That is making massive economic pressure all across the world. No one had put in our manifesto, let's have a pandemic, let's have a war in Europe. The people understand that this is a huge challenge, and at the same time, we're pushing through legislation that I think will make planning better, that will deal with some of the terrible things that happen on the internet. There's really important issues.
OK. Let's move on. Let's have a look at this headline in The Times. Gordon Brown, former Labour Prime Minister, his plan would give Holyrood extra scope for borrowing. This is all part of a report commissioned by Keir Starmer on Gordon Brown, looking at devolution and all sorts of plans to decentralise government from the centre. Let's talk to the Labour MSP, Sarah Boyack, there she is in Holyrood, who's also Scottish Labour's spokesperson on constitutional affairs. First of all, Sarah, what in all of this is going to change people's minds who want to see an independent Scotland?
Well, I think people want to see their government in Scotland delivering for them to get them through the crisis we've got in terms of the cost of living, and they want the powers to be used. I think for me what this does is it says you don't need the division of, you know, status quo versus independence. We could see a stronger Scotland, a stronger Parliament, stronger government in a transformed UK, and that is something that I think will actually begin to switch people across. We've already seen us doing well in by-elections in Scotland, and there's an appetite for change. People are fed up with the Tory government. They've been riding roughshod over devolution in recent years, but they really want change. And that, I think, is what a Labour government would deliver. And with the paper that Gordon Brown's put forward and that Keir Starmer has spoken so positively about, you can see we're doing the heavy lifting now. We're telling people this change is coming, sign up to it, and we will transform the country.
Drew?
It's a pretty thin gruel, actually, when you look at it. I think everybody remembers back in 2014 when Gordon Brown brought the vow out that we were going to have the most powerful Parliament. We're going to be near federalism, and what we've seen since then is the Internal Market Act, stripping powers away from Scotland and so forth. So that's not happened. More importantly, in this paper, you know, we know that things are not going to be delivered. The Labour Party have been telling us they're going to get rid of the House of Lords for 112 years, and they're saying it again. This is a thing they've passed down through the generations, I think, that manifesto to now. So I don't think anybody's taking it particularly seriously that that's going to happen. Of course, you know, if there's a genuine discussion on powers, we're always willing to have that. But what we've seen from Westminster time and time again is it just going back in its promises, as we've seen with the Brown vow of 2014, and as I'm pretty sure we'll see with this as well.
Sarah?
Yeah, I've just come back on that and say, actually, devolution has worked. It's been successful. We've got a strong Parliament, which has got new powers over the years, as negotiated. But the crucial thing is that we need to use those powers. And, you know, we discovered at the weekend, Scottish Government underspent by £2 billion. In a budget of 50 billion, that's pretty shocking. So we need change. And on the particular point about the House of Lords, what is significant about this report is it's out in good time. We've now got the heavy lifting that's been done. And if you think back to 1997, Labour government got elected, the Parliament was established in 2 years. That was massive constitutional change. So this is serious. The heavy lifting is being done. We'll be consulting. We'll make sure it's in the manifesto. And can I just make one point? The UK is out of step across the globe. You know, 780 odd appointed peers with the corruption we're seeing over the last few years. People want to change, whether it's Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle. There's an opportunity here, and a house that would be for the nations and regions, that would be transformative, and that's what's different. We're not just saying we want to change House of Lords, we're saying how, and we'll consult on the detail. And I take you back to 1997, we set up the Scottish Parliament, it's been successful. The bit we didn't focus on was taking power out the centre, and that's the key thing. 50,000 civil service jobs moving out of London, more powers to the mayors who've been very successful. So it's about democracy. And in Scotland, we need a bit of that as well, because we've got a government in Scotland that is centralising power. So time for change, a stronger Scotland in a transformed UK. I think the voters will like that.
What's not to like about that, Drew?
Well, the reality is, far from what Sarah's saying, is that the Westminster Parliament has been taking powers away. I mentioned the Internal Market Act. We saw the Brexit vote where 62% of people in Scotland voted against leaving the EU. That was completely ignored. Scotland's bid to have a discussion on that was completely ignored by Westminster here. We know that none of the things that were promised in 2014 have been delivered. We know that the very, as I pointed out, the very long-term promises from the Labour Party over the House of Lords are not going to be delivered. They're already rowing back on whether they do that or not, and talking about consultations. This is not going to deliver the change that they're
Sarah,
that makes the real difference for Scotland.
Sarah, can I ask you, can I ask you a question, Sarah? I mean, what I don't understand is what in this paper is going to persuade or change the minds of people who are in favour of independence, which is what you have to change those minds. They support Drew Hendry. What in this sort of commission is there that's going to change people's minds?
Well, there was only 30 to 35% of people thought we should have a referendum next year for independence. And I think the thing we'll be saying to independence supporters is, actually, independence is like Brexit times 10. Not my words, but somebody who supports independence.
But not for Scotland.
Did you mind not interrupting me? I didn't interrupt you. The point is, this is serious politics. We want to entrench devolution. And that point I made earlier about power from the centre, we established the Synod and the Scottish Parliament. What we didn't do was to radically transform the centre of the UK, and that's what's different about this piece of work. And that's why announcing it now, with Keir Starmer on side, means that this stuff's going to be in our manifesto, and people will know that that's what we'll get when they vote Labour
Can I
across
just
the
talk?
UK.
Can I just talk about the House of Lords? Because actually, what is your objection? An elected House of Lords, abolishing the way it's set up now. You could be part of that.
Well, what we've got at the moment, first of all, let's just put it in context. The House of Lords is a bloated organisation.
But we're talking about what's being proposed here by Labour.
Body outside in the world outside of communist China, I believe, just now. That's where we are at the moment in the UK. There's nothing, not against reforming the House of Lords. What I am against is the constant hot air about doing it and lack of action that actually comes from it. Whenever a Tory or Labour Party get into power, they've done no more than tinkering, basic tinkering, whenever they've been in power, despite the 100-odd-year promises for doing something with it. The interesting thing about this, though, is they would deny the people of Scotland their democratic right to have a referendum because of a mandate delivered to the Scottish Parliament, and yet they would have a referendum on these proposals, according to these papers. So a referendum for some people, but not for the people of Scotland who have voted time and time again.
Well, Sarah, respond on that point.
Yeah, well, I said, the opinion polls were clear. People in Scotland do not want a referendum now. And if I can remind you, it was the Scottish Government that actually took the case to the Supreme Court. So that is clear now. What we want is change, though, and that's what Labour would deliver. And
hang on, you say you will deliver it, Sarah, but I think you said it was 112 years or whatever it was regarding the House of Lords. What is the evidence that you would actually go ahead with this? Because senior Labour figures in the Lords, including the Speaker John McFall, don't like them. They don't like these proposals for an elected chamber, and they say it would challenge the supremacy of the House of Commons. So you don't even have sort of wholehearted support from the Labour Party.
No, I've spoken to a lot of Lords who are also very supportive, and it's about democracy, it's about accountability, and I'll go back to the point, it's about taking power out of London. If you look at the economics in the paper that Gordon Brown presented, we've got inequalities and they need to be addressed. And a key issue of a new House of Nations and Regions would be like the rest of the world, be more democratic, and it would empower Scotland, because at the moment we've seen the Tories ripping up devolution, and a key change we'd make is that the UK's got the power not normally to legislate on Scottish issues that are devolved to us, and the Tories have been overriding that. We would stop that happening, we'd remove that word, and we'd make sure that the powers we have in Scotland are ours to use, and they need to be accountable. And I just go back to, we set up the Scottish Parliament, in 1997, that was our commitment, we did that. There's the same passion and there's the same energy across the UK. People want change, we'll deliver it.
Sarah Boyack there at Holyrood, thank you very much. Let me just show you this headline in The Independent. Speaker of Lords warns against wholly elected upper house of Parliament. I mean, this refers to the proposal we've been discussing, Lucy, but it's interesting that we've had John McFall, David Blunkett and Peter Mandelson all saying they're very sceptical about this abolishing House of Lords reform idea and an elected second chamber.
Yeah, and in a way that's not surprising, is it? You don't get turkeys voting for Christmas. No. But there is something in what they say, I think, certainly David Blunkett and Peter Mandelson, and that this would soak up so much time and energy when we're heading into the longest recession since the Second World War. Is this the right priority? And therefore I'm not surprised that Keir Starmer has so far avoided making any firm commitment. And if I just add on the devolution point, I think the problem with devolution is either it's offered and it's a case of it's met with ingratitude. It's a case of give an inch, take a mile. And north of the border in Scotland, people want more. And the rest of England, I'm not sure it does really meet and answer the disaffection that we've seen, the Brexit issue that Keir Starmer thinks it does. And when I think of some of the examples of where devolution has been offered, I love a decade ago in Hartlepool when they had the opportunity to elect their first mayor, they chose a bloke in a monkey suit, the local mascot. You know, people don't necessarily want machinery of government changes. They want growth, they want good jobs and opportunities. And the two things don't necessarily match up in people's minds.
I mean, is it really a priority for Keir Starmer in his first term if they win the next election?
I think the problem is most of us would probably agree on what the problems with the House of Lords are, that there are too many peers, that some of the peers who get picked are possibly not the right selection. Some names come to mind, people like Baroness Moan, questions about why on earth David Cameron put her in there in the first place. But then when it comes to working out what the answer is and what model you want instead, that's when it gets difficult, and then that's when it's quite knotty. And that's why, even though Keir Starmer is saying that it's possible he could do it in the first 5 years of a Labour government, I think when it actually comes to working out what is going to be in your manifesto for these first 5 years, I think it's probably quite likely that it won't be in there.
What do you think about House of Lords reform, abolishing?
I don't think it's a priority. I also don't think
But you don't think it's a priority, but is it a good idea to have an
really,
elected second chamber?
You know, it is not a priority for my constituents. And indeed, in devolution, when I talk to my Scottish colleagues, they say, look, you've already got the powers over the NHS, schools, policing. Run those well. Those are what the people of Scotland want. And as for Keir on the House of Lords, and he complains it's too big, he's appointed twice as many peers in his time as Jeremy Corbyn did in his much longer time. And who's he put there? He's put his union paymasters, the head of Unite,
Vicky,
Unison, TUC.
Boris Johnson and Labour aren't here to answer. You've all stuffed the House of Lords with all sorts of cronies.
But that is important as well when you're looking at the relationship between government and the unions and strikes.
Right.
Okay? He's taken £22 million
but do you like
from
the idea
Unison
but do you like
and
the
then
idea of
pop
House
the
of
leader
Lords
in the
reform?
House of Lords. So, of course, you need to make sure you've got good people in the House of Lords because scrutiny in the upper chamber is really important. What I'm saying is that at a time when we've got massive global issues, again, we need to be focused, and I hope Labour would also focus on the issues that are priorities to people.
Let's have a look in the Telegraph. This headline: nearly 1 in 10 young people never intend to start working. That is quite a figure. It's the result of a new opinion survey for City and Guilds, the skills development organisation. Let's talk to Kirsty Donnelly, its chief executive. It's quite a shocking figure, isn't it, Kirsty? What's the reason behind it?
Well, yeah, no, it is very alarming, actually. And one of the reasons we decided to undertake the research is we wanted to really understand why was youth unemployment still so stubbornly high when we think about the marketplace we've got with so many vacancies that remain still unfilled despite obviously all the talk of recession. And I think what we found that a long period of austerity is really now impacting young people. This is not just the COVID factor. It goes back, or the pandemic, although that will be playing into this, but it's all the other things that have happened, say, over the last 10 years or so in terms of lack of funding into the right education and skills, and generally speaking, young people just not seeing the aspiration and the opportunity that lies ahead of them, unfortunately and worryingly, that they could go on to in terms of having good careers. And that's what we've got to really focus on putting right.
So is this an issue of them not being able to have the resources, and you talk about education, to pursue a career that they really have set their heart on? Because the figures say nearly 13% of 18 to 24-year-olds are classified as neither in work nor studying. So it's about the job market and it's about education.
No, it is. It's about those two coming together. I think it was 42% believe that they don't have the right education to equip them for the good jobs that they would like to be able to have. But I think it's much more nuanced than that, because within the survey, we know there are many young people who are facing lots of barriers and challenges that many adults haven't even had to face, around being young carers, having mental health and well-being issues, having been in the care system themselves. And so it's not just a case of just looking at one, the demographic of a young person. It's about looking at all of those multiple issues that many young people that we actually surveyed are having to cope with. But there's no doubt they are feeling let down, broadly speaking, by government and employers as well.
Kirsty, stay with us. What do you make of that figure, Lucy? 1 in 10 intend not to work, never intend to work.
I find it extraordinary and just really depressing. I think young people have had such a difficult time in the pandemic. I think there's so many barriers to sort of security that face young people, whether it's the rental market, let alone trying to one day afford your own house, wage depression for many years, hostile labour market, the marginal tax rate for graduates, also very dispiriting for people coming out of university.
John?
I think that you hear a lot from the government and about the record low in unemployment and how The figures are the lowest they've been in 40 years. Boris Johnson's last speech outside Downing Street was saying that the dole queue was shorter than the last time he was on a space hopper. But then when you delve into the details underneath this, the figures aren't quite so good. And I think clearly what needs to be done here is to encourage people into work, is matching what they want to do and making sure they've got the right skills so they can get into the jobs that there is need for people to do.
What was your reaction to the figure?
I was surprised to hear that it was that high. I mean, obviously, you're absolutely right, Lucy, on the pressure that young people have faced, especially during the pandemic. But I would say a couple of things. First of all, I remember the awfulness back in the last recession that we had 1 million young people not in education, employment or training. That's come down. There's been 5 million apprentices started since 2010, and I speak to many young apprentices who are really pleased. The Kickstart programme that we had
so why so many people never intending to start working? Because we just
heard 250,000 jobs were started.
But that doesn't stack up, does it, with those figures? Because if there were so many great opportunities out there, you wouldn't have this number of people saying.
So what I would say to any young person who's thinking about is the not the right job for me, do not have the right skills. If they've already finished their education, please go into your local job centre. I was in my local job centre on Friday. They're doing fantastic work, bespoke one-on-one work to try and find the right opportunities. We have put in the lifetime skills guarantees, which will help people of all ages to be able to go and get skills that they want to find the right job. And obviously, you know, the changes we're bringing in education with T-levels and other technical education to try and make sure that we mix better match young people's education with what employers offer is coming through, and that is also making a big difference. But my number one thing would be to say, if you don't think the right job is there for you, go into the job centre, make an appointment, get the advice. I've seen it firsthand. It makes
I mean, the situation's not much better in Scotland, Drew. The number of young people who are unemployed in Scotland has jumped by 15,500 over the last year, with youth unemployment rate rising from 8.3% to 13.5%. Is it a similar sort of situation? The reasons behind it, that young people don't think they have the education and skills to pursue the jobs that they would like?
Well, you know, I mean, it's a shocking figure. The UK-wide figure is shocking. If you're telling me, I haven't seen the sub-figures for Scotland that have been pulled out of this research, but if you're telling me it's somewhere near that, then that's something that obviously has to be looked at. I don't have the answers for you here about why that's happening just now. I know there's a lot of effort going in Scotland to make sure that people have the access to apprenticeships, that they get the access to further education. We've scrapped tuition fees in Scotland to make it easier for people to go to university.
Well, that's been quite a long time, though, hasn't it?
Exactly so. But as I say, I don't know the background for the figures that you're quoting just now, or indeed what they are from that report. But I would say there's a lot of effort going into it. We do need to make sure that, you know, wherever we are, whatever nation of the UK it is, that we're creating a place of hope for young people. And we have to focus on that in terms of how we develop policy.
Well, it's interesting, your issue, as you say, of hope. This is the Guardian headline. New UK disability claims double in past year, with fastest rise among teens. That's according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Say claims for the personal independence payment has doubled to 30,000 a month between the summer of 21 and July this year. Do you think, to some extent, the pandemic has promoted a culture of dependency?
I think, well, first of all, it's been really important that we can get those PIP payments out to people who need them, OK? And we have put more support for people with disabilities. But also, the other thing I saw when I was in my job centre on Friday is the work that's been happening with people who have disabilities to try and enable them to get into work. And that is, it does need extra support, but that is going in. And it's absolutely remarkable when you talk to some of the people who've been supported, how that's giving them hope, maybe helping them with mental health issues, which might have been part of it as well.
Well, Kirsty, what do you think? Do you blame the pandemic? You mentioned it in your earlier answers to be only partly responsible, but you listened to those figures there from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Do you think that may have some sort of bearing in terms of the position for young people and trying to find their way in the job market?
Well, there's no doubt it's exacerbated it, absolutely. But when you actually look at the data that lies behind it, which is why I say we can't just keep using the pandemic as the only reason. I mean, we're talking here about people who have received, well over a quarter have received free school meals over a long period of time. This is pre-pandemic. People have been a young carer pre-pandemic. So I think the pandemic has definitely exacerbated it. But of course, in some respects, you would argue, as I said earlier, given the amount of job vacancies there should be even greater opportunities for these young people. If only we could get the right careers advice and guidance. And I absolutely accept the reference to the job centres, but I think we need to do much more than that. We need to get out into the communities where the most disadvantaged are, in the sense that someone, for example, who's been a young carer is more likely to be 3 times less likely to access education, training or a job. And the job centre is not necessarily the answer. So we need to have much more grassroots ways of getting to these young people.
Kirsty Donnelly there, Chief Executive of City and Guilds. Thank you very much. Craig McKinley, your Conservative colleague, Vicky, has said that perhaps benefit sanctions should be introduced. This is him responding to the survey by the City and Guilds. He said it cannot be right for the taxpayer to support a lifetime of young people on benefits because they don't intend to work.
So I actually asked the Secretary of State about benefit fraud in a question on Monday in the House of Commons, because I do think it's important that one's doing both, that you're making sure that people who need benefits get them. That's why we did the uprating of benefits in the autumn statement, but that we're also tackling benefits fraud. And I was quite impressed with his answer, that it was over 100,000 people have their accounts have been stopped due to fraud. They're absolutely focusing on it. And it was, again, something the government said in the autumn statement, was to make sure that we've got that focus on people who, if they shouldn't be getting it, then they shouldn't get it. Well, yeah. If they should be getting it,
well, of course. I mean, that's how the system's supposed to work. But what do you think of what Craig McKinley is saying?
That's absolutely the wrong approach. The pandemic hasn't, heightened a culture of dependency. It's actually impacted people in their mental health and affected them in their homes. So it's natural that there should be an increase in the need for people to seek support. What I would say is this: you're constantly going towards benefit fraud when it's in every possible examination. It's an absolutely tiny percentage of the issue with social security is just a dogmatic and ideological way to approach this. What needs to be done is to have a good look at what the kind of support that people need. And as we're talking, if you want to give young people hope, if you want to give them the support, then that benefit system, the social security system, should be geared towards making sure people have got equal opportunities to get ahead in life. We should be supporting them, not castigating them.
Let's welcome viewers from the BBC News channel. You're watching Politics Live. We've got about 7 minutes until Prime Minister's questions. We'll take a look in the chamber in just a moment. We were talking about the reasons behind why so many young people, it seems from a recent survey, have said they don't intend to start work. You were disagreeing with Drew, Vicky. What were you saying?
No, I wasn't saying that people shouldn't get benefits. I said it's important that we do support young people, and the different changes that we're bringing in with the different types of technical education, the skills that they can get, and this is why we're bringing in T-levels, because that's all been in consultation with employers about what sort of skills do they need young people to be trained for. The increase in apprenticeships. I run an annual apprenticeship fair. It's really popular in my constituency. £20 a week cut to universal credit. So that they can have that link. We've uprating benefits in line with inflation for those who need it most. And there was additional universal credit support during the pandemic. You can't keep on the pandemic support forever. OK. We know that.
Let me just show you this BBC News story. Stephen Flynn elected as new SNP leader at Westminster. Your colleague, that election happened last night, so there'll be a change to the lineup at Prime Minister's Questions. It'll be Stephen Flynn asking questions of Rishi Sunak rather than his predecessor, Ian Blackford. Will there be a change of tone?
I think he'll bring a fresh approach to Prime Minister's Question Time. I think anybody who's listened to him over the past days since last night, since he's been elected, can tell that he wants to take a different way. That's what Ian has been doing for 5 years has been very successful. I think most commentators feel that he's been very effective when he's been doing this. I think Stephen will just bring a different approach, and I think it'll be a good one.
And will it be different in the sense that he will stand at odds to some of the principles and policies of Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister? I'll just show you this in the Daily Telegraph. Nicola Sturgeon's crazy position on North Sea oil faces challenge from SNP's rising star, the rising star being Stephen Flynn. Now, this is over decisions on whether or not to explore or extend and grant licences for more exploitation of oil and gas. Stephen Flynn in favour of it, much more so than Nicola Sturgeon, because of the jobs in the area.
What both of them have said, I mean, this is, you know, people love when they've got the SNP try and, you know, put them in the same context as Labour and the Tories in Westminster and pretend there's some big falling out going on. There isn't.
I'm not falling out, but I'm saying there's a different position.
Nicola Sturgeon and Stephen are on the same page in terms of the need for a just transition from oil and gas to renewables. In fact, the Scottish Government have invested £500 million, not matched by the UK Government, in the North East, and they're absolutely on the same page about doing that. There is no dispute about it.
All right, let's just have
say thank you for the 200,000 you got yesterday, though, from that Scotland got from the Shared Prosperity Fund.
Are you going to say thank you for the 50?
Oh, I see where this is going. Right.
Well, say thank
I'm
you
going
for the
to
money
say
you
thank
do
you
get.
on both your behalves. We'll just dip into the chamber. Questions continuing for another 5 minutes or so until we see Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer take their places at the dispatch box. Just briefly, partly the question to or about Stephen Flynn and Nicola Sturgeon's position on oil and gas is ahead of this coal mine decision in Cumbria, which we are expecting today from Michael Gove, not just divisions in the Conservative Party over the issue of fossil fuels. That'll be a big deal, won't it?
It will be. It's a decision that's been on the back burner for quite a bit of time. It was talked about a bit about when we had the COP Climate Change Summit in Glasgow. They were talking about should we be telling countries around the world to stamp out coal, where there was still a possibility we could have this new coal mine in the UK. And I think that's why you will hear from quite a few Tory voices who are opposed to this, including people like Alok Sharma, who was the COP president during that conference.
I think we can either see, or certainly I can trail Peter Barnes, my colleague from the Political Research Unit. He will be keeping an ear across any of the claims and counterclaims. There he is. Hello, Peter. As to what is happening during Prime Minister's questions. So more from him after PMQs. Let me just show you this headline in the Eye. Labour takes in more donations than the Conservatives for the first time in 6 years. How much should we read into this in terms of the strength of the party, John?
Well, I think the Labour Party is obviously buoyed by these figures, and I think it shows that a lot of people are now starting to see them as a serious party of government. You talk to shadow front benchers and they're saying that for the last few years they've not had so many invitations to go and speak to business leaders, but all of a sudden everyone wants to speak to them and work out what exactly would they do if they get into power.
Disappointing that you're losing the sort of financial support that you've had.
Oh, I'm just interested in, again, I've mentioned it before, the Labour relationship with the unions, because that is their big paymaster.
It's not any more than if you look at those figures. £4.7 million, and how much of it was from the unions, Vicky?
Over the last, since 2010, okay, £46 million.
Let's talk about now, Vicky.
But, what's happening right now is that people in my constituency are going to face the impact of these strikes, and they want to know that you've got a government that isn't in the pay of the unions. And I think when you look at Labour again and again and again, they're in the pay of the unions.
Or would you admit that the relationship, has changed then, listening to the figures now, that it's not the same relationship, and some of the unions, of course, have disaffiliated from
I still think that time and time again it is impossible for Labour to divorce themselves from their relationship with the union and say that they are could have an independent government.
Well, Labour aren't here, but, John, it is interesting because they do have to perform contortions sometimes when they're responding to backing the unions and strikes, as opposed to just supporting workers.
Oh, definitely, and I think you've seen that last couple of months. I don't think it's been particularly easy for Labour when dealing with this. But their lines at the moment, they're saying the government's being unreasonable. We saw Angela Rayner out yesterday saying the militants round here are the government not being able to get around the table and sort this out.
Lucy, the temperature in politics generally has come down a notch or two from a very high bar. It's not quite as high octane as it has been this year. Is that a win for Rishi Sunak?
I'm not sure it is. I think there needed to be a reset in terms of the pace after, frankly, the circus at the end of the Johnson and the short-lived Truss administration.
Everyone's nodding away with you there.
Nodding. But it does leave a vacuum. You know, I've been interested this week, a couple of stories from the Times splashing on opposition research, first on ambulance figures and then, and in fact, another NHS story from Labour. So if the government is trying to stop the pace of politics moving at such breakneck speed, that does allow Labour, the Lib Dems, the SNP to speak more. And of course, issues like strikes aren't going to go away. So,
do you think it's a deliberate strategy by Number 10? Do you think that is what they're actively doing? It's not just that Rishi Sunak is a different politician and a different Prime Minister.
Yeah, I do. I think there is a renewed sense of seriousness in Downing Street as well about wanting to grapple with policy issues seriously, not try and gamify the media by having an ever-running hamster wheel of announcements of things that aren't necessarily going to happen. They want to take their time a bit more to try and grip some of their priorities. They know there's only 2 years left till the next election. It needs to be things like the small boats crisis. They want to think about how to try and deal with that and deliver. But it does mean there is this sort of vacuum that is being filled with dissenting voices and with some of the sort of issues that are facing the country.
I think we can probably go into the chamber shortly. Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker, reading out notices just before Prime Minister's question starts, just before we do go in. Vicky, do you agree with that? It's left a vacuum.
I think when I talk to my constituents, they want stability. You know, we've seen, as you know, a very bumpy time. They know that we're in the middle of this war in Europe. They know the impact that that's had on prices. And it's incredibly difficult for whoever's trying to govern at the moment.
Let's go into the chamber. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Dr. Philippa. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the United Kingdom in its current form turned 100 years old. But neither the Prime Minister nor the leader of the Labour Party seem to recognise the challenge of the Supreme Court ruling as to the very nature of the union. He didn't answer me 2 weeks ago, so can the Prime Minister clarify if he still believes the UK is a voluntary union? And if so, can he explain the democratic route by which the people of Scotland can choose whether to stay in it or not?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we fully respect the decision of the Supreme Court and believe strongly in the United Kingdom. And as I said to the Honourable Lady last time, we will work constructively with the Scottish Government to deliver for the people of Scotland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Financial scams are the most common form of crime, causing immense emotional and financial distress to millions of people. And government efforts in this matter have tended to focus on making sure that scammers can't launder their proceeds of crime and that victims get compensation. Both of those are really important, but they're acting after the scams happened. Does my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, agree with me that government departments, regulators and industry, perhaps guided by an anti-scams task force, could do far more to stop scams happening in the first place? And will he meet with me to talk about this?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to highlight the hurt that scammers and fraudsters can cause. We are working closely with industry to block more fraudulent calls from reaching the public, and importantly, our new online safety bill will place duties on the largest internet companies to tackle scam ads. I would be happy to meet with my honourable friend to discuss further.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by welcoming the new Member of Parliament for the City of Chester to her place in this House. It's the best result for Labour in the 105 years we've been fighting that seat, and I look forward to working with her to build a better future for the people of Chester. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party promised the country it would build 300,000 houses a year. This week, without asking a single voter, the Prime Minister broke that promise by scrapping mandatory targets. What changed?
Mr. Speaker, let me start by also welcoming the Honourable Lady to her place. Now, the Honourable Gentleman comes here every week, and I know he's focused on the process and the politics, but I don't think he's actually taken the time to read the detail of what we are doing to improve our planning system. So let me just explain what we are doing. Mr. Speaker, we are protecting the Greenbelt. We are investing millions to develop brownfield sites. And we're providing support and protection for local neighbourhood plans. Just this morning, the Shadow Housing Secretary said, communities should have control over where homes are built and what sort of homes are built. That's my position, that's her position. What's his position?
Mr. Speaker, does he really expect us to believe that the member for Chipping Barton and the member for the Isle of Wight are cheering him on because he's going to build more homes? Pull the other one. I'll tell him what changed. His backbenchers threatened him. And as always, the blancmange Prime Minister wobbled. He did a grubby deal with a handful of his MPs and sold out the aspirations of those who want to own their own home. Was it worth it?
Mr. Speaker, as ever, engaging in the petty personality politics, not focused on the substance. Again, let me explain what we're doing. We're delivering what I said we would do. We're protecting the character of local communities. We're cracking down on land banking and irresponsible developers. And we're giving people a greater say in their decisions. Just this week, Mr. Speaker, on Monday, the Honourable Gentleman said the government should be giving people more power and control. Now he seems to be opposing that policy. It's only Wednesday. I know he flip-flops, but even for him it's pretty quick.
Mr. Speaker, he's forgotten. Last week I offered him Labour votes to pass these housing targets because this is bigger than politics. The former Housing Secretary on their side said scrapping mandatory targets would, this is his words from their side of the House, be a colossal failure of political leadership. No wonder he doesn't want to fight the next election, Mr. Speaker. The author of the manifesto that they all stood on said it would cut building by 40%, perhaps even more. Why would he rather cripple house building than work with us to get those targets through?
Mr. Speaker, we're not going to work with the Labour Party on housing. You know why? We'll have a look at their record on housing. In London, the former Conservative mayor in 5 years built 60,000 affordable homes. The current Labour mayor, half of that amount. In Wales, we want to build 12,000 homes. What are Labour delivering? Half of that, Mr. Speaker. The Labour Party talks, the Conservatives deliver.
Mr. Speaker, as ever, too weak to stand up to his own side on behalf of the country. Mr. Speaker, I noticed there was another U-turn last night, this time on wind farms. Actually, I agree with that one, but is there no issue on which he won't give in to his backbenchers? Now, Mr. Speaker, how did his colleague, Baroness Mone, end up with nearly £30 million of taxpayers' money in her bank account?
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me say, like everyone else, I was absolutely shocked to read about the allegation. It's absolutely right. It's absolutely right that she is no longer attending the House of Lords and therefore no longer has the Conservative whip. Again, the one thing we know about the Honourable Gentleman, he is a lawyer. He should know there's a process in place. It's right that that process concludes. I hope that it's resolved promptly. But I'll say one thing, Mr. Speaker, because I tell him what is weak. I tell him what is weak is not being able to. I'll tell him, and that's not being able to stand up to people. I know he's taken some advice from Gordon Brown lately. Why doesn't he listen to a former minister in Gordon Brown's government who just said, why does the Labour Party refuse to stand up for workers in businesses like pubs and restaurants who will lose business as a result of the train strikes? Labour should stand up for working people. If he's strong, that's what he should do.
Mr. Speaker, it may not seem like it, but he's supposed to be the Prime Minister. This morning, his Transport Secretary said that his flagship legislation on strikes, this is what he said this morning, his Transport Secretary, might want to listen to this, is clearly not going to help with the industrial action we're facing. He should stop grandstanding, stop sitting on his hands, get round the table and resolve these issues. And everyone can see what's happening here. A Tory politician got their hands on hundreds of millions in taxpayers' money and then provided Duff PPE, and he says he's shocked. He was the Chancellor. He signed the cheques. How much is he going to get back?
Mr. Speaker, it's right that he brought up legislation with regard to strikes, and I'm very happy to address it, actually. So hard-working families right now in this country are facing challenges. The government has been reasonable. It's accepted the recommendations of an independent pay body, giving pay rises in many cases higher than the private sector. But if the union leaders to continue to be unreasonable, then it is my duty to take action to protect the lives and livelihoods of the British public. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, since I became Prime Minister, I have been working for new, tough laws to protect people from this disruption. That's the legislation he's asking about. Will he now confirm that he'll stand up for working people and that he and his party will back that legislation?
Mr. Speaker, he's obviously not heard what his Transport Secretary said about that legislation this morning. And it's obvious why they're so opposed to Labour's plans to clean up Westminster. They all voted for tax rises for working people, while one of their unelected peers pocketed millions flogging dodgy PPE.
Should be ashamed.
Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to raise something that is worrying parents across the country. Our hearts go out to the families of the children who've tragically died from the outbreak of Strep A in recent weeks. I'm very happy to work with the government on this. So can he take the opportunity to update the country on the measures the country is taking to keep children safe this winter?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my thoughts are, of course, with the families of the children who have sadly lost their lives. We are seeing a higher number of cases from Strep A this year compared to usual. What I can say is that the NHS, who I have sat down to talk about this, are working very hard to make sure parents are aware of the symptoms that they should be looking out to, because this can be treated appropriately with antibiotics. There are no current shortages of drugs available to treat this, and there are well-established procedures in place to ensure that that remains the case. And the UK SHA are monitoring the situation at pace, and what they have confirmed is that this is not a new strain of Strep A, so people should be reassured about that. There is no reason to believe that it's become more lethal or more resistant to antibiotics, so the most important thing for parents to do is look out for the symptoms and get the treatment that is available for them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Airbnb-type short-term lets provide a positive experience for many holidaymakers, but too many cause real issues for local communities. In Westminster, we have 13,000 Airbnb properties alone. Does my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, agree with me that it is now time to consider a registration scheme managed by local authorities so councils can properly manage this growing sector?
My right honourable friend, the Levelling Up Secretary, has indeed said that we will deliver a new tourist accommodation registration scheme, something I know my honourable friend has asked for. It will increase appropriate regulation of the sector, better understand and monitor the impact on local communities, and we will also consult on whether planning permissions should be required for new short-term holiday lets, especially in tourist hotspots.
Can I welcome the new leader of the SNP and thank you in Blackford previously. Stephen.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I wish to begin by paying tribute to my friend and colleague, the Right Honourable Member for Ross Skye and Lochaber, who has served us with diligence and duty for the last 5 years. Mr Speaker, he is a giant of the Scottish independence movement. Mr Speaker, he's seen off not one, not two, but 3 consecutive Tory Prime Ministers. Indeed, he was on to his 4th in recent weeks. And to that latest Prime Minister, I have a very simple question. What does he consider to be the greatest achievement of the Conservative Party in government since 2019? Leaving the single market and customs union, ending freedom of movement, denying Scotland her democracy, or getting the Labour Party to agree with all of the above?
Mr Speaker, can I start by offering my genuine and warm, heartfelt best wishes to the Right Honourable Member for Ross Skye and Lochaber. I know the whole House will miss his weekly contributions. And may I also congratulate or join the First Minister in congratulating the honourable gentleman on his appointment as a Westminster leader of the SNP. I look forward to a constructive debate with him across the dispatch box. And Mr Speaker, the answer to his question is actually very simple. The things that we are most proud of in the last couple of years is making sure that we protected this country through the pandemic with furlough and with the fastest vaccine rollout.
Mr Speaker, far be it for me to offer advice to a near billionaire, but he's going to have to up his game. And here's why, because in the last 15 minutes, a poll has landed which shows that support for Scottish independence has now hit 56%. And support for the Scottish National Party sits north of 50%. So in that context, can I ask the Prime Minister, does he consider that increasing energy bills on households in energy-rich Scotland by a further £500 will cause those poll numbers to rise or to fall?
Well, Mr Speaker, what we're delivering for households across the United Kingdom, including those in Scotland, is £55 billion of support with energy bills. It will save a typical homeowner about £900 under their bills this winter, with extra support for the most vulnerable. And that is, Mr Speaker, an example of the United Kingdom and the Union delivering for people in Scotland.
David Morris.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the Eden Project North is now getting right to the end of the process. It's gone through right to the levelling up stage 2. It has planning permission, it has land allocation, it has everything that's going to offer the north of England. Prime Minister, when are we going to be getting the Eden Project North?
Well, Mr Speaker, my honourable friend, I think the whole House knows my honourable friend has been a passionate campaigner for Eden North for some time. I was pleased to work with him in my previous role. He knows I can't comment on any specific bid, but I know that the Secretary of State will be making these decisions by the end of the year, and I wish him and everyone involved in the project every success.
Thank you. Most people and businesses in Northern Ireland accept the need for the protocol and want to see negotiated, pragmatic solutions to the various challenges. While there has been a clear improvement in the mood music between the UK and the European Union over recent weeks, there is a growing frustration and concern at the slow rate of actual progress in those talks. So what steps can the Prime Minister take to inject some momentum into those negotiations? And indeed, can I encourage him to visit Northern Ireland as soon as possible, preferably before Christmas, to engage with local stakeholders around the protocol and also to hear views on how the Assembly can be restored via reform?
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and I enjoyed meeting him recently to discuss these issues. Let me give him and the people of Northern Ireland my assurance that I want to see the issues with the protocol resolved as quickly as possible. I do believe that if people enter into these talks that we are having in a spirit of goodwill and pragmatism, that we can indeed find a way through. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary and Vice President Sefcovic, are in regular dialogue, and I will take on board his suggestion to come visit Northern Ireland to discuss these things in person.
Hendry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We just had Small Business Saturday, where we marked the important impact small businesses have on our local communities. I, like many of my colleagues, have spoken to these businesses and heard just how great their concerns are for their future. When the Prime Minister was Chancellor earlier this year, he went with me to Fred Hallam in Beeston, a business established in 1908. SMEs such as this faced a pandemic and now rising energy costs. Can the Prime Minister lay out how he will ensure businesses such as Fred Hallam will be supported in the coming months so that they may thrive and continue to provide vital goods and services to my constituents in Broxton?
Thank you. Well, I know my honourable friend is a fantastic champion of his local businesses. It was a privilege to visit Beeston and Hallam's earlier this year with him, and I remember we discussed then some of the things we were planning to do, which are now going to make a big difference, saving businesses hundreds or thousands of pounds with their energy bills through our relief scheme this winter, our business rates tax cuts package worth over £13 billion, particularly impacting retail businesses, and with initiatives like the annual investment allowance and Help to Grow, we can take his small businesses to a whole new level. I look forward to working with him on that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A recent effort of select committees, both the author of the government's own National Food Strategy and the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to food, have called for universal free school meals to address the issue of the 4 million children hungry in the UK. Will the Prime Minister meet with me to discuss how investments in universal free school meals will benefit children and their families in Liverpool, West Derby and the country, and at no extra cost to the taxpayer?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know this is an issue on which the honourable gentleman has campaigned for some time, and he's right to highlight the importance of making sure our children have access to food. That's why I'm proud that we introduced not just an expansion of free school meals, but also the holiday activity and food programme. I'm always interested in more ideas where we can go further. I look forward to hearing from him.
Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whether on defence with AUKUS, trade with CPTPP, or diplomacy with ASEAN, I know this government recognises the importance of the Indo-Pacific to the UK's security and prosperity, but the challenges that exist, whether they are ballistic missile tests or the Belt and Road, are deeply interconnected. So can the Prime Minister confirm that the Indo-Pacific remains a UK priority and that he will take a holistic approach within government to meet the challenges and capture the opportunities that exist in the region?
Well, Mr. Speaker, last year's integrated review set out our Indo-Pacific tilt with regard to foreign policy. I reaffirmed this government's commitment to that tilt in a speech at the Lord Mayor's dinner just the other week, and he's right to highlight both the economic and security importance of the region. He should be reassured that we're pursuing not just free trade agreements bilaterally, but also CPTPP, the AUKUS partnership, and indeed, hopefully, a new partnership with regard to our future combat air system, all evidence that we are delivering on the tilt.
Siobhan McDonough.
Mr. Speaker, members across this House know the devastating impact of bank branch closures on our communities. But as banks flee the high streets, our free cash machines disappear with them, hitting the most vulnerable hardest. Surely it cannot be right that a quarter of ATMs charge people to access their own money. So will the Prime Minister join dozens of his own backbenchers today in backing my cross-party amendment and ensure that everyone has free access to their hard-earned money?
Well, Mr. Speaker, this government is indeed legislating to safeguard access to cash, and that's what the Financial Services and Markets Bill this afternoon will do through a very significant intervention. I'm also pleased that we put in place initiatives with the industry to subsidise free-to-use ATMs in deprived areas, and almost 50 communities are benefiting from our new shared cash facilities, because access to cash is important, and that's what our new bill will deliver.
Manchester.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the government's commitment to its hospital buildings programme. Can the Prime Minister clarify what criteria will be applied for the allocation of those new hospitals? And will it be done in line with the Prime Minister's personal commitment on a merits-based system of government? Because my hospital in Medway serves 500,000 people and is the busiest hospital A&E in Kent. We have some of the highest health inequalities in the country. We were one of the hardest hit areas in Medway during COVID-19. We need our fair share allocation of resources in Medway. Will the Prime Minister visit Medway Hospital with me and fellow local MPs to look at our urgent need?
Well, my honourable friend is a fantastic champion for his local area, but especially for his local hospital. He'll know that I can't comment on any specific scheme, but I can tell him that submissions to be one of the new hospitals are currently being reviewed in the department, and an announcement will be made shortly.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Small Business Saturday, I was delighted to name Daisy Rose Coffee House as the City of Durham's Small Business of the Year 2022 after a public vote in my inaugural award. But like so many small businesses, Daisy Rose Coffee House is the beating heart of the local community and the cornerstone in their high street. But so many business owners that I meet with feel utterly ignored by the government as they're clobbered by outdated business rates year after year. The government must pick a side. Are they going to continue to back the online giants, or will they join the Labour Party and back small business and scrap and replace the outdated business rates?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate Daisy Rose for winning their award and being the beating heart of their high street. I very much hope that they will benefit, and I'm almost certain they will, from our discounts on business rates. Our retail, hospitality and leisure relief gives a 75% discount on business rates in the next financial year, and that comes on top of the support that we'll be providing Daisy Rose and others with their energy bills, with bills being about half of what they would have otherwise been without our support.
Connor Barnes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can I thank you and colleagues across the House for your kindness and encouragement in recent weeks. Can I ask my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, this afternoon to recommit the government he leads to our ambition of levelling up communities in every part of our great United Kingdom? And to that end, could I invite my right honourable friend to come and visit my Bournemouth West constituency and see the latest school rebuild, the multi-million-pound rebuild of the Oak Academy, which will stand as a lasting tribute of opportunity to the people I have the privilege of serving in this House.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I say that it's very nice to hear from my right honourable friend today, and he's absolutely right. There is no better way to spread opportunity around the country than by investing in our children's future. I'm absolutely delighted that Oak Academy in his constituency is benefiting from our school rebuilding programme, and I will certainly ask my office to keep his kind invitation in mind.
Alan Dorrans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've raised this matter before, but despite meeting with a previous Prime Minister in 2020, this matter has not progressed. In 1984, I was a serving police officer in Metropolitan Police when, on the 17th of April, WPC Yvonne Fletcher was shot in the back and killed whilst policing a political demonstration outside the Libyan embassy. No one has ever been charged in connection with her murder. In November last year, in delivering his judgment in a civil case, a senior High Court Justice, Mr. Justice Spencer, said, "I am satisfied that on the balance of probabilities that the defendant, Saleh Mabrouk, is jointly liable for the shooting of WPC Yvonne Fletcher on the doctrine of common design." Will the Prime Minister meet with me to see how this case may be taken forward and finally bring those responsible for the murder of Yvonne to justice in a criminal court?
Oh, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his continued work on this case. As he said, it's something that he has raised before. He'll appreciate that while I can't speak in detail on any particular case, there are differences in the standard of proof required for civil and criminal proceedings. That said, the CPS will consider any new information that is referred to them by the police in relation to this case, and of course, I'd be very happy to meet with him.
Jackie Doyle-Price.
Returning to the theme of communities being able to decide where to build, in Thurrock we embrace our obligations to deliver more new homes, and at Arena Essex we have an application to deliver 2,500 new homes ready to go. However, there is a standing objection to any development over 300 homes from National Highways because of the impact on junction 30 of the M25. Could I ask my right honourable friend what advice he gives to Thurrock Council as to how they can deliver their housing obligations with this national constraint?
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for her question, and she highlights a great example of a council that is trying to do the right thing and put the right homes in the right places. They should have our support. If I'd ask her, please, to write to my right honourable friend, the Levelling Up Secretary, with the details of the issue so we can give her a full response, but praise her council to trying to make sure that we can build the homes where we need them.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why can't the government process asylum claims within 6 months, thereby saving £5.6 million a day on asylum seekers' accommodation, granting asylum to those who need it quickly, and stopping the abuse of the system, which currently has a backlog of 147,000 asylum claims?
Mr. Speaker, what we are doing is significantly increasing the number of caseworkers. We are on course to double it by next spring, with several hundred already in place. And she is right that the process takes longer than it should. Often, that is because people are able to exploit some of the rules in our system and make sequential claims. That is exactly the type of thing that the Home Secretary and I are working on fixing, and I look forward to having the party opposite support when we do.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There have been more reported deaths and adverse reactions following mRNA vaccination in 18 months than there has been to every conventional vaccine administered worldwide for the last 50 years. And given that mRNA vaccines are not recommended for pregnant women or those who are breastfeeding, would my right honourable friend overturn the Big Pharma-funded MHRA's recent recommendation that these experimental vaccines are administered to children as young as 6 months of age?
Mr. Speaker, let me first say that I believe COVID vaccines are indeed safe and effective. And no vaccine, COVID or otherwise, will be approved unless it meets the UK regulator's standards of safety, quality and effectiveness. We have an independent body. The JCVI determines which age groups the vaccine is recommended for use in as part of the vaccination programme, and of course the ultimate decision will lie with parents.
Kevin Bladden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During COVID, we all applauded our NHS nurses who put their lives on the line to help millions of our constituents and our loved ones. But we now know that at the same time, Tory spivs were helping themselves, using their connections and COVID to help themselves to millions of pounds of public money. Why is the Prime Minister on the side of the spivs and not on the side of the nurses?
Mr. Speaker, what everyone was doing at the time was working as hard and as quickly as they could to get the PPE to get the PPE needed for our frontline workers, including our nurses. Actually, there was an independent procurement process. Ministers were not involved in the decision-making, but it was right, Mr. Speaker, but that people gave their ideas about where to get them from. Indeed, the Shadow Chancellor herself suggested that we should get PPE from a law firm. She suggested we should get ventilators from a football agent. Everyone was trying as hard as they can. We should remember the context and stop playing politics.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 weeks ago, more than 350 people attended a meeting in Skegness to discuss the use of 5 seafront hotels to house asylum seekers. They were united in their view that there was a long-term economic impact and a pressure on public services. They told me loud and clear that, like the Prime Minister, they think hotels are the wrong place for asylum seekers. Does he agree with me that the government needs urgently to lay out a plan that moves beyond the use of hotels, puts asylum seekers in the right place for them and the right place for coastal communities such as those in Skegness?
I completely agree with my honourable friend. We are now spending £6 million a day housing asylum seekers. Hotels are incredibly expensive. We will urgently bring forward proposals to reduce the pressure, but as he knows, as I know, the best way to solve this problem sustainably is to reduce the number of illegal migrants coming to the United Kingdom, and that's what this government will deliver.
Chris Elmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Audit Wales has confirmed that the Welsh Labour Government responded well and got on with the job of delivering value for taxpayers' money. Can the Prime Minister tell the House what first attracted him to awarding £1 billion of COVID contracts to Tory donors and supporters, and what is he doing to claw taxpayers' money back?
Again, Mr. Speaker, we delivered 32 billion pieces of PPE to the front line at a time when there was a global shortage. As I've already said, everyone tried to do their bit. We heard recommendations from the Shadow Chancellor, but it was right that hers and everyone else's suggestions went through an independent process where ministers were not involved in the decisions.
Robin Walker.
Josh McAllister's independent review of children's social care has been with the government since May, and I understand there's been some disappointment that the response to it won't be published before Christmas. But can the Prime Minister ensure, given the very important recommendations about some of the most vulnerable children in our society and the families who support them, the people who support them, that there will be a strong and robust government response as early as possible in the new year?
Yes, my honourable friend obviously knows this subject area well. He's right to highlight the importance of making sure that we do provide good quality support to vulnerable children. The report has a lot of interesting suggestions in it, and he's right, and I can commit to him, we will respond in due course.
Final question, Claire Hanna.
Thank you very much. Prime Minister, over 70% of Northern Ireland's international tourists arrive to Dublin and travel across the land border. The UK Government's proposed electronic travel authorisation would likely mean the North being struck off the itinerary of operators and many independent travellers. And the last thing we need is a barrier to one of our biggest economic drivers, to say nothing of the impact on non-Irish and British people living in Ireland. Members from across the House have acknowledged that our border isn't a normal one. Will the Prime Minister commit to scrapping this unworkable proposal?
Mr. Speaker, I can give the Honourable Lady my assurance that we remain very committed to the common travel area and indeed do not want to see any checks on the island of Ireland, and that's why we're working very hard to resolve the issues with the protocol and ensure Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom.
And that brings us to the end of this week's Prime Minister's Questions. I'm joined, as always, in this half of the programme by the government, represented by Andrew Bowie, the Exports Minister today, by Labour, the Shadow Justice Secretary Steve Reid, hello to you, and the BBC's Deputy Political Editor Vicky Young. We're going to talk about strikes in just a moment. But Vicky, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, focused a number of his questions on the Conservative peer, Baroness Michelle Mone. Give us the background to this story.
Yeah, well, this is all about how personal protective equipment contracts were handed out during COVID. Now, you'll remember at the time there was an absolute desperate scramble to get hold of this kind of stuff. So what the government did is it set up a VIP lane, a kind of priority process whereby MPs and peers from any party could recommend companies that they knew about who would be able to provide it. Now, in 2020, there was a company called PPE MedPro. They were awarded 2 contracts worth more than £200 million. A published list later revealed that the Conservative peer, Baroness Mone, was the source of the referral. She named this company and said that they could come up with the goods. And a Cabinet Officer Minister then put it onto this VIP high priority route. Now, she has always denied links to that company. Her lawyers say she had no role or function in PPE MedPro. But The Guardian reported that a trust in which the peer, her and her children were beneficiaries, and it says that they may have received as much as £29 million originating from the company's profits. Now, the House of Lords Commissioner for Standards has launched an inquiry but says he's unable to finalise or publish it because the matter is under investigation by the police or another agency. So that is the background to what's been going on with all of this.
Now, you mentioned The Guardian, this headline, Mone, Michelle Mone, you see they're lobbied for second firm with secret links to husband. What is this about?
Well, this is another claim, as you say there, in The Guardian. Their report saying they've seen documents linking another firm called LFI Logistics with Douglas Barrowman, her husband. We haven't managed to verify those reports. The government has said that the new firm, that firm, didn't get any contracts, and she and her husband have previously denied various claims about their involvement in all of this. But as you can see there, it is absolutely rumbling on.
We have various statements from Baroness Mone, who rejects the allegations that she benefited personally and financially from the awarding of these contracts. And a spokesman for her has said that the legal team, her legal team, are dealing with what they call a witch hunt situation. Rishi Sunak said he was shocked by the allegations and the claims, but not shocked enough, it seems, to have withdrawn the Conservative whip from Michelle Mone. In fact, it was up to her to take a leave of absence, and then she did lose the whip as a consequence of that. Why wasn't it taken away by Rishi Sunak?
Well, firstly, I share the shock felt by the Prime Minister. I think just about everybody else reading the allegations in the newspapers this morning and in the previous few days. It's absolutely right that she's taken a leave of absence from the House of Lords. That means she no longer takes the Conservative
take that
whip.
preemptive move himself?
She now no longer takes the whip. We believe in the premise. Now, these allegations are shocking, but we do believe in the premise of innocent until proven guilty. There's a police investigation ongoing. There is going to be an investigation within the House of Lords itself. We should allow those investigations to run its course. But before jumping to conclusions, however, if they are proved correct, these allegations are absolutely shocking, and it's absolutely right that she has stepped back from the House of Lords as the process is seen through.
And if she decides to go back on her leave of absence, let's say in a month's time, but we haven't had the conclusions of these investigations and inquiries, should Rishi Sunak take the whip away again?
I think we get drawn into hypotheticals here. The fact is she no longer, right now, has a Conservative whip. She is no longer in the House of Lords. She is no longer an active Conservative peer. And I think that we should now let the investigations, the multiple investigations, run their course.
Right. The government has been called on by Labour to publish the documents around how contracts were awarded, and it's committed to do so. When can we expect those documents to be released? And will they be released in full or will they be redacted?
That's a question for the Cabinet Office, who I presume are dealing with this process right now. There was a humble address yesterday. The Labour Party won their motion front in Parliament, and we are now committed to respond with the papers. And as I said, the Cabinet Office will be seeing the process through as we speak.
Well, I mean, it sounds like there is a proper process underway, Steve. An investigation and an inquiry, and Michelle Mone has taken a leave of absence herself. She is no longer a Conservative peer. I presume you'll wait for the outcome.
Well, I think you're right to say that she should have had the Conservative whip withdrawn. It's the nature of the allegations, the scale of them. Of course, that should have happened, but the Prime Minister hasn't done it. He keeps showing himself to be weak in many respects. This looks like another one to me. And underpinning that, I mean, does anyone else remember Rishi Sunak, when he was competing for the leadership of the Conservative Party, saying that the first thing he would do would be to appoint an ethics advisor? Where is that ethics advisor? He still hasn't appointed somebody. It's got rid of by Boris Johnson. Liz Truss never put anybody in, and now we have yet another scandal bubbling under, and there's no ethics advisor to advise the Prime Minister. And
that's still the intention of the Prime Minister to appoint an ethics advisor. He stands by what he said.
Well, he said he'd appoint one, and he hasn't.
Well, he will appoint an ethics advisor. He has only been Prime Minister for 5 weeks, and there's been quite a lot going on in the country in that time.
For a lot of your Prime Ministers.
Yeah, well, not this one. He's going to be in position for a lot longer than that, and he will be appointing an ethics advisor. That remains a commitment from 10 Downing Street, and we look forward to him doing so.
Well, I mean, on this issue, we shouldn't talk about the details of this issue, I'm sure.
No, and actually, because you're Shadow Justice Secretary, I mean, you do believe, I presume, in natural justice and the process taking place.
Well, robust justice, which isn't what we see from this government. And actually, what this is part of is a much bigger picture of, breathtaking levels of cronyism, if not corruption, from this government. I'm not referring to this case,
right,
Joe, but in general, the VIP lane and the way that, cronies, friends of Conservative MPs were able to siphon off £2 billion of public money into the bank.
Steve, I'm just going to sort of correct you in terms of the terminology. Siphon off does make it sound like it's corrupt. But hang on, even generally on PPE, I know that's what you believe happened, doesn't mean it did happen.
Steve, Labour MPs and Conservative MPs, we have to remember the context of the times we were living in right there. We had a shortage of PPE across the board. We were doing everything possible within our power to get PPE into the country and on the front line. And Labour MPs, like Conservative MPs, were putting forward suggestions to government for companies in their constituencies that were able to help with the situation we were in.
And it was nearly all Conservative MPs, was that the friends and business associates of Tory MPs got themselves put on a VIP lane that gave them 10 times more likelihood of getting a contract than other British firms who had been doing that kind of work for years. And Matt Hancock's pub landlord got given a contract over British businesses that have been producing that kind of PPE for decades.
Let Andrew respond and then I want to move on.
It is borderline corrupt.
Hang on. We need to retract all this idea of corruption because you don't know. I understand the claims as you are setting them out and how you believe the situation, but to say that it is corrupt,
that is my view. I'm sorry about that. It's been said in the House of Commons.
It isn't justified, and I think there's an independent process going on right now looking at the entire situation around the period that we were living through at the time, and we cannot forget the context we were in. The National Health Service was crying out for personal protective equipment. We pulled out all the stops to deliver PPE on the front line, and we did that at the same time as delivering the fastest vaccine rollout in the country and getting this country through the pandemic.
As a veil for cronyism.
Well, you can't use the pandemic. You can't use the pandemic as a veil for
there was some
personal
£2 billion
that's
got missing.
I'm going to stop you both there because I want to repeat the statements by Michelle Mone and her legal team. Her spokesman has said the allegations that have been unjustly levelled against her, obviously separate to what you've just been talking about, and that they will deal with what they call this witch hunt situation. Let's move on and talk about the strikes, as I said was also discussed at PMQs. Talk to Peter Barnes, my colleague in the Political Research Unit. Peter, what did you pick out from today's exchanges in Prime Minister's questions that I can talk to my guests about?
Well, Keir Starmer raised this interesting question about this proposed law, which is called the Transport Strikes Minimum Service Levels Bill, and I'm just looking at it here on the Parliament website. And that is an idea for a law that was first introduced by Liz Truss when she was Prime Minister. And the idea is that if transport workers go on strike, like the train workers, the rail workers currently are, they would still have a legal obligation to provide minimum service levels, even though they were on strike. Now, this bit of law, this proposed law, was introduced to the House of Commons. It was published on October the 20th. But since then, we've not seen anything else of it. So it's waiting for what's called its second reading, which is when MPs first get an opportunity to debate it. As I say, it was introduced about 50 days ago, and there's no sign yet of when it's going to come back to Parliament. So Keir Starmer was asking Rishi Sunak about that. But he did also say that the new Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, was in front of a committee this morning and said that this legislation wouldn't really help in the current dispute anyway, because it will take too long to get through Parliament. Even once it's gone through its first debate in the House of Commons, there are other stages and it has to get through the House of Lords. But anyway, it's an interesting question for your panellists. What has happened to this bill? Is it going to come back anytime soon? Will it help people who are facing strike action, passengers who are struggling on the railways? But it's a question for your Labour guest as well, for Steve. Does Labour support this bill? Because I think pretty certainly Labour Party is opposed to it. So it'll be interesting to hear what they say.
Peter Barnes, thank you very much. Well, let's pick up on those questions, first of all, with you, Andrew. Where is this anti-strike legislation that was promised?
Well, firstly, Mark Harper in front of the committee is absolutely right. Unfortunately, due to the time it takes to get legislation through Parliament, the legislation, good as it is, the proposal is, would not actually help with the situation that we're facing within the next 2 weeks. We simply could not get the legislation through Parliament in time to alleviate the situation that customers, people across the country are facing in the next 2 weeks.
So is it being put on the back burner? Is it going to happen?
That's obviously a decision for the Prime Minister. The legislation has been published. We are determined to enact legislation to reduce the impacts that strikes have on the British public. They were, frankly, holding the British people to ransom and destroying a lot of people's Christmases in the process. So, yes, of course, we're going to be bringing forward legislation to deal with this. But the proposed legislation...
When's it going to happen? I mean, we heard the date there, October the 20th. There is now going to be strikes across the board in all sorts of industries. But let's just take the rail strikes, for example. There are at least 8 to 10 strike dates now. As you say, it wouldn't have affected these particular dates. But if you're saying...
Even if we introduced it on proceeded from the 20th of October, very unlikely we would...
But your claim is that the country's being held to ransom.
Absolutely.
Why isn't it a priority? Mark Harper, the Transport Secretary, said it's just not a priority.
It is absolutely a priority.
But he said it wasn't a priority.
Mark Harper and the Transport Department and the entire government are engaged right now in negotiations to try and alleviate the pain and the misery that's going to be caused by the Labour Party's paymasters over the next few weeks on the people of this country. And it'd be very interesting. Do the Labour Party agree with the Conservatives that legislation is required to prevent these strikes taking place or to prevent the impact on strikes on the British population?
Steve?
Well, the reason we're facing a winter of discontent.
Yeah, but do you support
we're facing a winter of discontent because for the 12 years the Tories have been in, that has been the worst decade for wage growth since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And now, at the end of all of that, we're seeing inflation running out of control because this government has lost control of the economy, and indeed their kamikaze budget that Liz Truss imposed caused a run on the pound and caused inflation to increase and caused mortgage and interest rates
like
to escalate. So no, but what's happening is people can't make ends meet. I've met nurses working in the hospital in my constituency that go to food banks because they can't afford to get food on the table. What is required from this government isn't draconian legislation to force people who can't pay their bills anymore because this government lost control of the economy.
Too scared to speak up against the unions.
Well, and you're speaking up against nurses who can't afford to feed themselves and their kids.
Speaking up against nurses, we're engaged in discussions with nurses about increasing.
What we need, Andrew, is a government that's prepared to govern, sit down, bring to the table the two sides of these many disputes that are happening, and get a negotiated settlement. But as I understand it, neither the Health Secretary nor the Transport Secretary have been prepared to sit down and convene face-to-face discussions between the two sides to get to a resolution. We've got a government that refuses to govern and a cost of living crisis that is putting real financial pain on households, and the Tory response legislates to force them to go to
what we've
work.
got is what we've got, frankly, is a Labour Party who are willing to bend over backwards to their union paymasters, and at a time when the RMT are crippling this country, doing huge damage to the hospitality sector, and by the way, the first normal Christmas they should have had for 3 years due to the pandemic, and cancelling people's Christmases.
Yes?
The question was on the transport.
Pandemic, but now
this specific question was on the transport strikes and the rail strikes, and the fact is you're on the side of the unions and not on the side of the British people.
Well, so you wouldn't support anti-strike legislation, further anti-strike legislation
I think
to
the
limit.
government shouldn't put people in the position where they feel they have to strike.
Well, that's not the answer to the question. But if the legislation comes back, would you support it? No.
No, because I don't think people should be forced to go to work.
On the side of the
it is a right to withdraw your Labour. It is a right to, Michelle Mona's just withdrawn her Labour from the House of Lords. Would you pass legislation to force her to stay in there?
I think, right, I'm not going to get drawn on that question.
On the legislation, though, when is it going to happen? I mean, it keeps being promised. If you think it's going to be a game changer, not for these strikes, but for any future strikes, why don't you make it a priority and present it in January?
It is a priority, and we present it very soon.
So, Joe, I think part of the problem is that there are ministers close to particularly the talks with the rail unions who are still optimistic that they can reach a deal. Now, not, as you say, in time to deal with the ones over Christmas, but in the longer term, they do think a deal could be done. And I think there is some concern that this legislation would inflame potentially the situation. Remember, under Liz Truss, there was talk of other legislation bringing in higher thresholds. Now, yesterday they were asked about this at the Westminster lobby, and actually the Prime Minister's official spokesman just saying, well, that's speculative. That does seem to have gone away. But yeah, there's definitely a big question here, but also for Labour about talking about the amount of money that nurses, if you think they should be paid more, how much more do you think they should be paid?
Well, I mean, there's no prospect, unfortunately, of a general election for at least 2 years, it appears.
Steve, you must have an idea.
You must have a ballpark figure
by then. So something that the Labour Party has put forward. Here's something the Labour Party has put forward. The strike in the NHS isn't just about pay. It's also about the terms and conditions and the burdens and the shortage of nurses that there are. We would scrap non-dom status and use that money to have the biggest expansion of nurses and doctors our NHS has ever seen. We want nurses, not non-doms. That is a sensible way that would ease the pressure on nurses today. But your party votes against that.
No, Steve.
And we know why, don't we?
Steve, the government takes the advice of the independent panel on public sector pay. That is what determines our offer to the various unions, including within the National Health Service. Would you follow their recommendations as well if you were in government? That's the question the Labour Party has to ask.
What needs to happen is that the Health Secretary, Stephen Barclay, has not sat down to listen to the nurses and to bring the employers together
Steve,
to make sure that there
would
can be
you follow? I mean, governments guide and governments can advise in terms of pay increases or not. Would you follow the recommendation of the pay review bodies?
It's certainly something we need to take into account, but the key issue here is it comes after a decade of wages held down, a decade of underinvestment in the NHS, and a shortage of nurses relative to the numbers of people.
We keep hearing that the Labour Party is a government in waiting. We keep hearing that the Labour Party is a government in waiting. Instead,
and invest that money in nurses.
We keep hearing the Labour Party is a government in waiting, but on two of the biggest questions facing the country today, do you support the RMT and their strikes through Christmas? Would you follow the principles and the advice of the independent peer review bodies. You cannot answer those two
Well,
questions. Instead, what do we have?
Andrew,
we have a 700-page report published by Gordon Brown, supported by Keir Starmer, on constitutional reform and the House of Lords, when we are facing the big issues that are facing the British people right now, and we are prepared to take the tough decisions to get Britain through
your
the
government lost
situation
control
we're
of the
facing right
economy,
now.
and people need a pay rise because they can't afford to make ends meet. Now, if you want to legislate to force people to go to work when they can't afford to get food and have to go to food banks, nurses, who I presume you, like me,
we want to legislate to protect this country from being held to ransom by trade unions, which are the Labour Party's paymasters.
There were no
forward.
strikes in the NHS under 13 years of the Labour government. How has it come to this? It's their government that has caused this problem. And the answer to it is not to take punitive draconian action against nurses who can't afford to feed their kids. It's to make sure that we have a health service that works for people and an economy that's growing fast enough to pay people decent wages.
Let me show you.
Completely disingenuous. You know that we're facing global inflationary pressures. You know the reasons that we're in the situation we are in. It's nothing to do with the domestic policies of this government. We are taking action to guide this country through the difficult
Conservatives
period we're in.
always say this, but of the 38 countries in the OECD, we have the lowest growth. All of those countries have got those same headwinds across the whole world. What is the unique factor that makes this country fall so far behind? It is this incompetent Conservative government.
All right, let's have a look at this headline in The Independent. More than 40% of British exports have disappeared from European shelves since Brexit. It's based on new research from Aston University. Do you accept, Andrew, that Brexit has made it more difficult for businesses to export to goods and services? You are the Exports Minister.
Yeah, look, our exit from the single market and the customs union has obviously changed the relationship between British exporters
and made it more difficult.
But we are determined to resolve the situations, to make it easier for British exporters to get their goods onto shelves within the European continent. As each day goes past, companies in this country are finding it easier to get their goods into Europe. We're determined to make it even easier than it is right now.
Has it made it harder? Has Brexit made it harder?
It's changed the relationship. There's no doubt about that. And of course, it takes time for companies to get to grips with, to understand and to easily navigate the new rules and the systems that are in place. We're in the Department for International Trade committed to actually simplifying the process.
How are you going to make it easier? I mean, because the research also shows a reduction in product varieties being exported to the EU. Isn't that going to hurt businesses if they're producing fewer things because they can't sell them?
Yeah, but we're determined to drive up exports, not just to Europe, but around the world. Look at what we're doing in Australia and New Zealand. Look at the discussions that are going on with the
trade deal that the former DEFRA Minister George Eustace said was a rotten deal, even though he supported Brexit.
Well, you won't be surprised to find that I disagree wholeheartedly with George Eustace's prognosis of the deals that we've done with Australia and New Zealand. They're groundbreaking, especially for many areas of the UK economy that are growing. Financial services just being one of them.
You want to increase exports to the EU
Yes.
from where we are now. How are you going to do it?
Various ways. We're in the middle of discussions. We've got a target of getting the UK up to £1 trillion of exports. Of course, Europe is a major market for British goods.
Sure.
They want to buy our stuff, and we're working hard across the board to simplify the process by which British companies get their goods into Europe.
Right, but imagine, I know nothing about this, and actually I don't know anything about how businesses trade. How do you do it?
We're going to simplify the customs process. That's going to mean engaging with various countries across the European Union and, of course, making it a simpler process to do all the paperwork, the new paperwork.
Are you hoping to do that individually with countries in the EU rather than doing it with the EU as a whole?
There will be a variety of discussions that are ongoing between the UK and the EU as a whole and individual countries.
Are they receptive to that?
Pardon?
Are they receptive to that?
Yes, of course they are. They want to buy British stuff. We want to sell them our stuff, and we're going to, and trade's going to go up.
You must embrace this because, of course, Keir Starmer's made a big thing about making Brexit work better than the Conservatives, but you're not going back to rejoining the single market. No. You're not going back to freedom of movement. No. So how would you do it?
No one wants to reopen those divisions. But, you know, as Andrew put it, you can't easily navigate a fatberg of bureaucracy at the British borders. And what's happened is hitting smaller and medium-sized companies, the biggest, companies that can't afford to have warehouses in continental Europe. They're finding that it's become nearly impossible for them to export and trade with Europe.
But you're supporting Brexit, so you must think that there's an upside to this.
I've got a textile company, a clothes manufacturer in my constituency that used to do enormous amounts of trades with the European Union, and they've had to stop and lay off staff because of it.
Well, have you got an idea for Andrew to take on? What would Labour do?
What we need to do is look at where we can align standards and reduce the the tariffs and barriers at the border to allow trade to flow more easily. These companies are having to fill in. They showed me one of them.
deal.
I'm not sure the EU would accept a Swiss-style deal.
Switzerland doesn't like the Swiss-style deal.
But you know, 30-page forms that you have to fill in for each type of goods that you're going to export. They negotiated this, and we need to get rid of it.
Aligning with EU standards.
It's not about closer alignment. It's about simplifying the process at the border. We're going to digitise the process. This is quite technical, but we have got a process underway right now, Border 25, whereby we want to digitise the entire customs process. That will make it much simpler and much easier for British companies to export to Europe. But we need buy-in from both sides. It's all well and good.
Well, it sounds like it's
all well and good for Steve to sit here and say we need, you know, a close alignment on standards and all the rest of it. But that's going to take, you know, goodwill on both sides. Now, we are determined to do what we need to on our side. We need cooperation and engagement with. Well, we are.
If you look at the Northern Ireland Protocol, veteran standards.
We haven't got time for the Northern Ireland Protocol. We've got 45 seconds. It sounds like these two agree, Vicky, on at least this issue.
Yeah, but that's the interesting thing, isn't it, about this whole discussion about Brexit and the implications. Actually, Labour aren't particularly going on the attack on it because of the reasons we've just heard. So, yeah, if they can both come up with some ideas to make it easier, then maybe that's the way forward for Rishi Sunak, who does seem to be compromising with lots of people, certainly in his own party at the moment.
All right, well, we're going to leave it there. We'll do the Nile and North Protocol another time. That's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests. And Adam Fleming will be here in the chair tomorrow with Politics Live at 12:15 on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer. Bye-bye.